911.
We have a 10-year-old who is either faking it or...
The phone rang. It was Veronica Posey, her voice shaking. The 911 operator picked up, trying to maintain composure as Veronica rushed the words into the phone. I have a 9-year-old. She's not breathing. Or maybe she's faking it. I don't know. Please, I need help. In the background, you can hear her panic, the chaos unfolding in real time. A child. A 9-year-old girl named Derica Lindsay, the life slipping away from her as Veronica desperately tries to figure out what went wrong. Was it an accident? Was it punishment that went too far? Veronica's words blur together as the operator tries to make sense of what's happening. But one thing was clear. The situation had turned into something deadly, something irreversible. It's every parent's nightmare, right? A moment when a child, a vulnerable child, finds themselves trapped in a situation they can't escape. But this wasn't an isolated incident. No. This story starts long before that 911 call, when 9-year-old Derica Lindsay, who should have been playing, laughing, and simply enjoying being a child, was living in a house where love was scarce and safety was even scarcer. Veronica Posey, a cousin, was called in to help discipline Derica. Veronica, a 64-year-old woman, retired, medically struggling, but a woman who thought she could control the chaos with force. The call came late morning, and by the time Veronica arrived, Derica was in full defiance mode, resisting everything Grace and James tried to do. What started as a routine moment of punishment quickly turned into something much darker. As the investigation unfolds, layer by layer, the shocking details come to light. A pattern of abuse, years in the making. Derica's life wasn't just taken in a moment of frustration. It was shaped by years of neglect, mistreatment, and a lack of proper care. But before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank you, my incredible viewers and subscribers. Your likes, shares, and thoughtful comments don't just support this channel. They help keep these stories alive. If you're new here, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and become part of this growing community that believes every story deserves to be told, and no victim should ever be forgotten. Now let's get into it. In Northwest Florida, Derica lived with her foster parents, Grace and James Smith. Two people, getting on in years, struggling to keep up with the chaos of raising two young children, one of them full of fiery resistance. Derica Lindsay should have been in school, laughing with friends, running around, and having the kind of childhood that every child deserves. But instead, she was trapped in a house where every day felt like a battle. A 9-year-old girl, bright and full of life, was living in a world that didn't care for her. Her foster parents, Grace and James Smith, just couldn't handle it. They were overwhelmed, constantly finding fault in every little thing Derica did, even things most kids her age would do without a second thought. The house was falling apart, literally. No air conditioning in the sweltering Florida heat, moldy mattresses that were more like prison bedding than anything resembling comfort, and a constant battle for space. Derica and her younger sister were left to fend for themselves, often seeking refuge with friends just to escape the suffocating environment that was supposed to be their home. Does that sound like a place where a child should grow up? However, Derica wasn't an easy child to handle, no. She fought back when things weren't right, and she wasn't afraid to speak her mind when she felt mistreated. But the line between discipline and cruelty in that household was razor thin. And when Grace couldn't manage Derica anymore, she made the call that would change everything. But it wasn't just any call. This was a cry for help. Help from her niece, Veronica Posey. Now, Veronica was no stranger to the family, but she also wasn't exactly the warm, comforting figure you'd imagine coming to a child's rescue. No, Veronica had a different way of dealing with problems, and on that day, she was summoned to the Smith household, called in like some kind of enforcer to handle the situation. Veronica, 64 years old, weighing in at over 320 pounds, and waking up to this chaos in the middle of her day, drove over to the house, her mind probably already set on how she'd deal with Derica. No one expected what would unfold when she arrived at 12:15 p.m. She came armed, not with love, not with care, but with tools for discipline, tools that any child would dread. A broken wooden ruler, reinforced with a metal pipe. That was Veronica's version of correction. But Derica? She wasn't backing down. At just 9 years old, she fought back with everything she had, described as bucking, resisting, refusing to comply. Some would call this misbehaving, others would call it survival instinct kicking in, but that's for you to decide. And Grace? Well, Grace was just as ready to step in, attempting to use a belt on Derica. But that wasn't enough. It never was. The belt didn't work, and the frustration just piled up higher and higher. Veronica, already angry, already determined, took control. She pushed Derica into a kneeling position in front of a chair, but that didn't make her stop resisting. So Veronica did something unimaginable. She sat on her, sitting on a child, a 9-year-old girl. That's what Veronica thought would put an end to Derica's defiance. Can you even wrap your mind around that? How far did it go before anyone realized the magnitude of what was happening? For over 6 minutes, Veronica sat on Derica's back, pinning her down, suffocating her. And all this time, Derica, poor, frightened Derica, kept saying, "I can't breathe." Can you hear those words resounding in your mind? How desperate she must have been, trying to hold on to life, fighting for air. But Veronica? She brushed it off. "Stop faking it," she told Derica, as if a child could fake not being able to breathe. And it wasn't until she stood up, feeling the quietness in the room, that she realized something was terribly wrong, something she couldn't undo. Veronica moved quickly as panic set in. She rushed to revive Derica. Vinegar, water, chest compressions, but nothing worked. Derica wasn't moving. She was gone. Imagine the moment Veronica stood over Derica's lifeless body, her breath catching in her throat, the weight of the reality sinking in. This wasn't just a moment of punishment gone too far. This was a death at the hands of the very people who were supposed to protect and care for her. How many times have we heard about something like this happening, but it never quite hits us until it's right in front of us? The horror of what adults can do to a child, the complete disregard for their life, their rights. It's chilling. And yet, we find ourselves asking the same question every time. How did we get here? How did we get to the point where a child's last moments were spent gasping for air, and the one person who should have stopped it kept going? It was at this point that she called 911. "I have a 10-year-old. She's either faking it or she's not breathing. I don't know. Please, I need help." She was rushed, her words tumbling over one another, each one more desperate than the last. But when the dispatcher asked the simple question, "Did you sit on her?" Veronica hesitated, and in that moment it became clear. She was trying to downplay the severity of her actions. "I was just trying to restrain her," she said. "I didn't sit on her fully." But her words didn't match the scene. They didn't match the reality of what had just happened. The tension was building, like a tight rope slowly being pulled, ready to snap. The dispatcher's questions became sharper, her voice more direct. She needed to know what happened. But Veronica's denials made everything harder. The situation, it was dire. It was beyond fixing. And no matter what Veronica said, it didn't change what had already been done. The minutes dragged on, with Veronica stumbling through instructions to revive Derica, following them as best she could. But the weight of what she had done loomed over every word. CPR was performed, but it was too late. It was always too late. And when the paramedics finally arrived, their faces told the story before they even spoke. Derica Lindsay, a young girl with a life full of potential, was declared dead at the scene. The world had just lost a light, and it was clear that nothing could bring her back. But the truth? The truth would come out. It always does. The autopsy results were as disturbing as you'd expect. Asphyxiation, smothering, the very thing that Veronica had been so determined to deny in that 911 call. And the bruises? They were everywhere. Excessive, brutal marks on Derica's small body, each one telling a story of punishment far beyond what was necessary. But what we didn't know yet, what was about to be uncovered, was that these weren't just the result of a single moment of rage. No, this was part of a pattern, something much darker and far more disturbing. Veronica, Grace, and James, all of them arrested. It wasn't just about the fatal moment anymore. It was about everything that had led up to it. Veronica Posey, the one who had acted out of some misguided sense of discipline, was charged with first-degree murder. And Grace and James, they were slapped with charges of child abuse as the investigation peeled back the layers of their failed care. Because when you look at it from the outside, it's hard to ignore the dysfunction, the neglect, and the abuse that was simmering beneath the surface. Here's where things take a turn, though. It wasn't just a random act of violence. It wasn't a mistake. No, the more the investigation dug, the more they uncovered. And let me tell you, nothing about this case was as simple as it first seemed. Witnesses, family members, they came forward with testimonies about the Smiths' home. The home Derica had been trapped in. It was a house that was meant to offer her safety, but instead, it was filled with rage, anger, and confusion. Derica had been punished before, physically, repeatedly. This wasn't the first time. And that's when the question shifts. How many times had this happened before? How many times had they ignored the warning signs? And how many times did Derica cry out, only to be silenced, dismissed, or punished even more? Veronica may have been the one who physically ended Derica's life, but Grace and James? They weren't innocent bystanders. They were complicit. The whole house was complicit in the neglect that led to Derica's death. This wasn't just a one-time failure. It was the culmination of years of pain, and unfortunately, it was all too common. As the interrogation continued, the detective uncovered more about Veronica's background. A retired government worker, once a controller, someone who had spent her life behind a desk, managing numbers and people, but never really connecting with those around her. She had medical conditions that limited her mobility, yet she still thought she could control a child through force. The emotional distance between Veronica and Derica was evident in the way Veronica spoke about her. There was no tenderness, no empathy, just cold, calculated discipline. Veronica was not someone who was emotionally invested in the child. She was just another figure who saw her role as a form of authority. A role that, in her mind, justified everything she did. At that moment, it became clear. This wasn't about a moment of anger or frustration gone wrong. No. This was about a woman who had dehumanized a child and turned discipline into something monstrous. Veronica's lack of remorse was as chilling as the facts themselves. There she sat, in that cold interrogation room, trying to convince the detective, trying to convince herself that she hadn't done anything wrong, but the evidence was undeniable. Now let's talk about Grace. Indeed, she had her own set of issues, both physical and mental. She was clearly struggling. But you see, struggle doesn't give you a free pass to neglect and abuse. It doesn't excuse the fact that she watched in real time as her niece, her flesh and blood, put Derica through hell. It doesn't matter how unwell Grace was. She still had a responsibility that she completely failed to uphold. It's heartbreaking to think that despite the years of struggle and suffering she'd gone through, Grace allowed herself to slip into a place where her own mental and physical health overshadowed the life of the child in her care. And James? James was no better. He had his own challenges, his memory issues constantly preventing him from functioning as an active, present parent. But that didn't mean he wasn't aware of what was happening. He might have been confused, but confusion doesn't excuse inaction. There's no defending standing by and watching the abuse unfold, even if your memory is failing you. That failure of memory didn't stop him from witnessing his niece's pain, from seeing Derica's body squirming beneath the weight of Veronica's actions. He could have stepped in, he could have stopped it. But instead, James remained a passive observer, an enabler in the most tragic sense. Now let's talk about the legal outcome. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. Veronica Posey was charged with first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's harsh, but it's fitting. The weight of her actions, the sheer cruelty, deserved nothing less. It didn't matter if she didn't fully understand what she was doing in that moment, or if she tried to downplay the gravity of her actions. In the end, it was clear. She made the choice to kill a child, and she would live with the consequences for the rest of her life. As for Grace, the woman who had called Veronica in the first place, who had stood by while her niece suffocated a child, she was convicted of aggravated manslaughter. And though she was given 20 years in prison, it still doesn't feel like enough. 20 years for what? For a child's life that was taken too soon? For the abuse and neglect that had been happening in that house for far too long? Maybe it's something, but it will never bring Derica back. It will never make up for the life she lost. James, too, faced his own legal consequences. His plea of no contest resulted in a 10-year sentence for child abuse. It's hard to imagine how someone who had the opportunity to stop it all could simply stand by. But the system deemed him complicit enough to sentence him for his inaction. And maybe that's the only silver lining in all of this, that the law recognizes that just being there, watching and doing nothing, makes you just as responsible as the one who pulls the trigger. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave this broken family, now fractured by the consequences of their actions? Grace is in prison, Veronica is locked away for life, and James is left to reflect on what he did or didn't do while his family crumbled. And Derica? She's gone. A young girl with a bright future, robbed of her chance to grow up, to laugh, to love. A life lost because the very people who were meant to protect her couldn't find it in themselves to step up. After the tragic death of Derica Lindsay, her funeral and burial became a somber reflection of the community's loss. Derica, a 9-year-old girl full of life, was remembered by those who knew her as a bright, joyful, and loving child. Despite the pain surrounding her death, friends and family who were close to her made sure to honor her memory in the best way they could. However, her burial took place without a proper gravestone initially. This was a heartbreaking reality for those who wanted to give her a dignified resting place. But as the case gained attention and people rallied to her memory, funds were raised by her friends and supporters. They worked together to ensure that Derica would have a gravestone that marked the place where she was laid to rest. The community's response to her death was one of outrage and grief. Many expressed their shock and disbelief, unable to understand how a child could be subjected to such horrific treatment at the hands of the very people who were supposed to care for her. Derica's friends, especially, were left devastated by her death. Having seen a vibrant child they loved, now gone in such a violent and avoidable way. Her story sparked anger and a call for child protection reforms, particularly focusing on the need for more oversight in foster care systems. Local leaders and advocates who supported the cause began speaking out, emphasizing how her death should serve as a reminder of the importance of protecting children and ensuring that those entrusted with their care are held accountable. The public sentiment on social media and in local communities resounded collective plea for justice and a promise to never forget Derica's name. People spoke of her sweet nature, the memories they shared with her, and how she was taken too soon. Her tragic story remains a harsh reminder of the consequences of neglect and abuse, and how sometimes the system fails to protect those who need it most. Derica's story, while tragic, has sparked a broader conversation around child welfare, abuse prevention, and the importance of holding adults accountable for their actions, especially when it comes to children. And now, as we reflect on this tragedy, we must ask, how many more children are out there suffering in silence with no one to help them? How many more families are broken beyond repair? How many more lives will be lost because the people who are supposed to protect them fail them time and time again? This isn't just a story about Derica Lindsay. It's a story that speaks to a much bigger issue: a failing system, a fractured society, and a terrifying reality that far too many children face every single day. As we close the chapter on this heartbreaking case, there's one thing that stands out: how fragile the line is between child discipline or correction and child abuse. All right, let's lean into these statistics first, because they're more than just numbers. They're a wake-up call. In the U.S. alone, nearly 1 in 7 children experience abuse or neglect each year. That's 10 million kids, and over 1,500 of those kids die every single year from abuse and neglect. Let that sink in. 1,500 lives, not just numbers, lives cut short. And most of these deaths, they could have been prevented, because it all starts with a belief. I'm the parent. I have the right to discipline my child. Now, take the case of Derica Lindsay. Here's the truth. Derica was not perfect. She was rebellious. She was stubborn. She was being defiant, resisting her caregivers in ways that no one could ignore. And let's be real, children do misbehave. They push boundaries. They act out. We've all been there. So yes, Derica deserved to be corrected. Discipline? Absolutely. But the real question is, when does correction cross the line? And this is where things get complicated. We've all heard the phrase, spare the rod, spoil the child. It's deeply rooted in culture, in values passed down, especially in communities where discipline is seen as an essential part of raising children. But here's the catch. The law doesn't support that when it leads to harm. And we saw exactly that in Derica's case. Now, is she a stubborn child who pushed back against the authority of her caregivers? Yes. Does she deserve correction? Yes. But at what point does that correction stop being effective and start being dangerous? Because at some point, punishment stops being about teaching and becomes about control. Look at what happened to Derica. Veronica Posey, her own family, tried to discipline her with a broken ruler, a metal pipe, and finally, by sitting on her. She was restraining her. She was trying to get her to submit. But when do we stop? Because when Veronica sat on Derica, ignoring her cries of, "I can't breathe," that wasn't correction. That was something else entirely. That was abuse. Now think about those statistics again. How many more children are out there, being punished under the guise of discipline, where the line isn't clear and it goes too far? We like to think we're in control, that we know the right way to teach, but when do we draw the line? Where do we, as a society, draw that line? It's not just about, I'm the parent, I know what's best. It's about recognizing that we must protect children, even from ourselves, when we don't know where that line is. So now, I want to hear from you. What do you think should be the consequences for those who abuse children under their care? Should they be held accountable for every moment of suffering they caused? How do you deal with rebellious children, and what's the line between correction and abuse? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation, because this is something we all need to think about, and we all need to do better. And if you found this story important, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more true crime cases. Your support means a lot. It helps us bring these stories to light, and it's through sharing, discussing, and learning from them that we can make a difference. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.